Gojo's infinity works by bringing the mathematical concept of infinite division into physical space. When an object moves towards Gojo, the technique continuously divides the remaining physical distance between him and the object by half. This creates an infinite sequence of smaller and smaller gaps, meaning the object slows down exponentially and never actually prevents people from ever touching it. And this isn't even the craziest ability. Jujutsu Kaisen might have some of the most insane and unique abilities in all of anime. And what's crazy is that I'm not even talking about the characters who are simply the strongest. So today, we're going through some of the most insane abilities in Jujutsu Kaisen. And by the end, you'll see why the power system in this series is so damn creative. Let's start with something that technically isn't even a curse technique: Heavenly Restriction. A Heavenly Restriction is basically a binding vow you're born with that takes something away from you and gives you something else in return. In some cases, the trade-off is absolutely insane. The best example of this is Toji Fushiguro. Toji was born with practically zero cursed energy, and you would think that would make him one of the weakest people in the entire Jujutsu world. But instead, Heavenly Restriction completely removed his cursed energy and gave him an absurd physical body in exchange. Toji's strength, speed, senses, reflexes, and physical abilities became so ridiculous that he could fight elite sorcerers without even having a cursed technique. And Maki eventually reaches a similar state after Mai's death removes the last of her cursed energy, which basically means that in JJK, having absolutely no cursed energy can actually make you stronger. And that's what makes Heavenly Restriction so insane. The series takes what should be a massive disadvantage and turns it into one of the most terrifying power-ups in the entire verse. You're essentially trading supernatural abilities for a body that can become a supernatural ability by itself. And Toji is proof that you don't need cursed energy to become a monster. And if you thought having no cursed energy was crazy, Hakari's technique takes things in the completely opposite direction. Because Hakari's higher domain expansion is basically a gambling machine. His domain, Idle Death Gamble, forces the opponent into the rules of a pachinko game based on a fictional romance series. And if Hakari hits a jackpot, something completely ridiculous happens. He gets unlimited cursed energy for exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds. But that's not even the crazy part, because Hakari's body automatically uses reverse curse technique to heal itself, meaning that for those 4 minutes and 11 seconds, Hakari is essentially immortal. And I mean that literally. If he's missing an arm, it regenerates. If his body gets destroyed, he can heal himself. And because he has unlimited amount of cursed energy during that jackpot, he doesn't have to worry about running out while doing it. The funniest part is that Hakari's technique isn't really about overpowering someone with one massive attack. It's about making himself so ridiculously difficult to kill that you basically have to survive his entire jackpot. And once the jackpot ends, he can potentially hit another one. So Hakari basically turned gambling into immortality. And somehow JJK made that one of the most entertaining abilities in the series. But Hakari's ability still follows the normal rules of a power system. Takaba's technique completely destroys those rules, because Takaba has one of the most ridiculous abilities in Jujutsu Kaisen. It's called Comedian, and the basic idea is almost impossible to take seriously. If Takaba genuinely thinks something is funny, it can become reality. That's it. He doesn't need to overpower you, he doesn't need to have more cursed energy than you, and he doesn't even necessarily need to understand how powerful his own technique is. If you find something funny enough, reality itself can bend around the joke. And this becomes absolutely ridiculous during his fight with Kenjaku. Kenjaku is one of the smartest and most experienced sorcerers in the entire series. And yet, Takaba's technique is so unpredictable that Kenjaku has to completely change the way he fights. Because how do you counter someone whose power is basically whatever I think is funny can happen? You can't just calculate the amount of cursed energy behind the attack, and you can't even overpower the technique, because the ability isn't really about raw power in the first place. It's about Takaba's perception of comedy, and that's what makes Comedian so terrifying. JJK basically created a reality warping ability and disguised it as a joke. And then we have Haruto Shigemo, which might be the funniest example of JJK giving a relatively unimpressive character a ridiculous ability. Haruto is an absolute bomb. Nonetheless, his ability is absolutely insane. Haruto's curse technique is called Miracles, and essentially Haruta can store small miracles inside of himself. These miracles are represented by marks on his body, and whenever something that should kill him happens, one of those stored miracles can be consumed to save him. So basically, Haruta has extra lives. And what's crazy is that Haruta himself isn't some ridiculously powerful special grade sorcerer. He's actually pretty weak compared to 99 99% of the characters we follow throughout the series. But his technique gives him something incredibly valuable: the ability to survive things he absolutely shouldn't survive. This is especially important because someone can land what should be a fatal attack on Haruta only for him to somehow still be alive. And that's what makes Miracle such a strange ability. It's not necessarily powerful because Haruta can destroy mountains or fire some gigantic attack. It's powerful because it changes the consequences of losing. Normally, if you get hit by an attack that should kill you, the fight is over. But Haruta's technique gives him another chance. It's almost like JJK gave a side character extra lives in a video game. And now we get to one of the most unique curse techniques in the entire series: projection sorcery. Naoya's technique is based around something that sounds completely harmless: animation. Specifically 24 frames per second. Naoya can essentially divide 1 second of movement into 24 frames. And once he activates his technique, he has to follow a predetermined movement path based on those frames. And here's where it gets ridiculous. If his opponent is touched while Naoya is using projection sorcery, they're forced to follow the same rules. And if they fail to move according to the predetermined frames, they're frozen for a moment. So Naoya basically turned the principles of animation into an actual combat ability. And this makes him insanely fast, because instead of being a basic speedster, his technique gives him a specific system for controlling movement. And the more effectively he uses that system, the more ridiculous his speed becomes. It's one of those abilities that sounds completely stupid if you explain it in one sentence. Yeah, this guy fights using 24 frames per second. But then you actually see it in action and realize, wait, this is actually broken. And that's one of the biggest reasons I love JJK's powering system, because Gege will take something as random as animation frames and somehow turn it into a legitimate weapon. But if you thought turning animation into curse technique was weird, Higuruma literally turned a courtroom into a domain expansion. His domain is called Deadly Sentencing, and instead of immediately attacking his opponent, Higuruma puts them on trial. A Shikigami called Judgment acts as the judge, and the person inside the domain is accused of a crime. The evidence is presented, and the defendant has the opportunity to defend themselves. And then Judgment gives a verdict. And depending on the verdict, Higuruma can confiscate the opponent's cursed technique or cursed energy. But it gets even crazier, because if someone receives the death penalty, Higuruma gains access to Executioner's sword. And getting hit by this sword can result in an instant death. So think about how insane this is. Most domain expansions basically say that you're just trapped in my technique, I'm gonna try to kill you. Higuruma's domain says you're going to court. And somehow that court can end with an execution. And what's even crazier is that Higuruma was originally a lawyer, so his curse technique basically turned his actual profession into a supernatural weapon. He's not just fighting you, he's prosecuting you. For the 7th ability, we have one of the most ridiculous abilities in the entire series: Yuki Tsukumo's Star Rage. At first, the technique sounds pretty simple. Yuki can give herself and go to the virtual mass, and this allows her to increase the force behind her attacks without physically becoming larger, which already makes her punches absolutely devastating. But then you realize just how far this technique can actually go, because Yuki isn't simply increasing her physical strength, she's manipulating the concept of mass. And during her fight with Kenjaku, this ability gets pushed to an absolutely insane extreme. Yuki uses her technique to turn herself into a black hole. Yes, a literal black hole. And obviously, a black hole isn't exactly something you would expect to see in a shonen fight. That's what makes Star Rage such an insane ability. It starts with Yuki making herself heavier and ends with Yuki creating an astronomical phenomenon powerful enough to threaten everything around her. That's the kind of escalation JJK constantly does. It takes a relatively simple concept, mass, and then asks, what happened if we take this concept as far as physically possible? And apparently, that leads to a black hole. And if Yuki turning herself into a black hole wasn't enough, Sukuna has an ability that takes the idea of a slash and completely breaks the rules of defense: the world-cutting slash. At first, it sounds like just another version of Sukuna's dismantle, but that's not what makes it so dangerous. Instead of simply targeting the person in front of him, Sukuna expanded the target of his slash to the space or world that the target exists within. And that's how he was able to bypass Gojo's infinity. Normally, infinity prevents attacks attacks from ever reaching Gojo. It doesn't matter how fast or powerful the attack is because the attack has to travel through the space between itself and Gojo. But Sukuna's world-cutting slash doesn't simply try to travel through infinity and hit Gojo. It targets the space that Gojo himself exists in. So instead of asking the impossible question of how do I get through infinity, Sukuna basically found a way to make infinity irrelevant. And that's what makes the ability so insane. Sukuna didn't just create a stronger slash, he changed what the slash was actually targeting. He took a technique that was already capable of cutting through almost anything and expanded its target to the world itself, which is exactly the kind of ridiculous ability that makes JJK's power system so interesting. And that's exactly why I think Jujutsu Kaisen has some of the most insane abilities in anime. Because these techniques aren't simply powerful, they're built around completely ridiculous concepts. Heavenly Restriction turns having no cursed energy into an advantage. Hakari turns gambling into temporary immortality. Takaba turns comedy into reality manipulation. Haruta turns luck into extra lives. Naoya turns animation frames into a deadly weapon. Higuruma turns a courtroom into a death sentence. And Yuki turns mass manipulation into a literal black hole. And honestly, that's what makes JJK's power system so interesting. JJK isn't simply making characters who are either strong or weak. He's turning the craziest ideas into abilities. And somehow, things like gambling, comedy, animation, law, and physics become some of the most dangerous powers in the entire series.